He took the night shift because it paid well and seemed easy, but no one told him about the rules, the impossible rules that kept the dark things outside. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. We promised you a list of rules that were never meant to be read, and we're going to deliver. This is the story of a man who thought a security job was simple, a man who learned that some buildings require more than just locking doors. He learned that the only thing standing between the world and whatever was outside was a yellowed piece of paper. The job was advertised as light overnight security. That's what Drew liked to call it. It was a single, 3-story corporate office building on the edge of town, surrounded by a big empty parking lot. He just had to sit at the desk from midnight to 8 a.m., check the doors twice, and keep the coffee hot. Easy money. He had done it for 3 weeks without seeing a single soul, not even the cleaning crew. On the 23rd night, Drew was bored. He started going through the drawers of the main reception desk, just looking for old office supplies. In the very back of the bottom drawer, under a stack of dusty training manuals, he found a folded piece of paper. It wasn't standard office paper. It was thick and felt like canvas, and it was yellowed like it had been sitting there for 30 years. He unfolded it. Across the top, written in neat, tight handwriting, was the title, Midnight Protocol. It wasn't the protocol he had been trained on. This was different. He scanned the numbers. There were 22 rules listed, and they made no sense. Rule 3 said, the main lobby light must never dip below 700 lumens. Rule 9 said, a bowl of water must be placed beneath the elevator shaft at 1:15 a.m. sharp. And Rule 14 stated, the reflection of the 3rd floor window is not the 3rd floor window. Do not acknowledge it. Drew laughed to himself. It had to be a prank left by some former security guard to mess with the new guy. He crumpled the paper up and tossed it toward the trash can, but he missed. It landed next to the can, perfectly flat, as if someone had uncrumpled it on the way down. That was the first strange thing. He bent down to pick it up, but when his hand was inches away, a sharp, cold wind hit him from nowhere. The draft smelled intensely like burnt iron and wet earth. He looked up, checking the main entrance doors, but they were shut tight. The heat was usually cranked in here. Now, his breath fogged in front of him. He picked up the paper quickly. He didn't toss it this time. He smoothed it out on the desk, feeling a sudden chill travel up his arms. He realized the fluorescent light over his head seemed to be flickering, making the whole room pulse slightly. He had never noticed that before. Drew suddenly remembered Rule 3. The main lobby light must never dip below 700 lumens. He had no idea what a lumen was, but the light was clearly dying. He hit the ceiling panel with a broom handle, and the light flared brightly again, then held steady. As soon as it held, the burnt iron smell vanished. He swallowed hard. Maybe it wasn't a joke. He picked up his standard issue walkie-talkie. He was supposed to check in with the central office every hour, but he knew they would just tell him the building was old. He put the walkie-talkie down. He was on his own in the middle of a dark, empty business park. He read the list again, now taking it seriously. He looked at Rule 11. The basement access door must be kept secured with at least one foreign object of personal value. Drew glanced down at his wrist. He had an old, battered watch his grandfather gave him. He took it off. He grabbed his flashlight and headed to the basement door. The door was a heavy steel slab, painted gray. He slid his grandfather's watch into the locking bolt mechanism, jamming it so the bolt couldn't be slid back easily. As the metal scraped, he heard a sound from directly beneath his feet. It was a slow, heavy drag, like a sack full of stones being pulled across concrete, deep below the floor. The sound stopped exactly when the watch settled into the lock. He stood there, holding his breath, waiting for the sound to start again, but there was only silence. He went back to the front desk faster than before. He checked the time, 2:45 a.m. The rules were like a tight schedule. Rule 19. Do not allow the temperature in the main corridor to drop below 60 degrees after 3 a.m. He checked the thermostat, 65 degrees. Okay, he was safe for now. But Rule 14 kept sticking in his mind. The reflection of the third-floor window is not the third-floor window. Do not acknowledge it. The reception area faced the wall, but there was a large, polished brass plaque on the wall with the company logo. In the reflection of that plaque, he could clearly see the windows on the third floor. He knew he shouldn't look, but his eyes kept drifting. He saw the usual dark squares of glass reflecting the faint streetlights outside. Then, in the middle window of the third floor, a tiny flicker of movement appeared. It looked like a shadow moving very fast. He pulled his eyes away, focusing on his hands. When he looked back at the brass plaque, the reflection in the third-floor window was still. But the glass in the reflection looked different. It looked wet. That was the turning point. He felt the cold air rush in again, stronger this time. Drew knew he had broken Rule 14 just by looking twice. The penalty was coming. He went straight to the main desk and looked down the hallway. The lights, which he had just fixed, were starting to strobe now, making the corridor seem to jump and shake. He ran back to the desk, grabbing the paper. He saw that Rule 4, which he hadn't noticed before, was suddenly underlined in red ink. Never allow the air to remain still for more than 3 minutes. The silence was deafening, the air was heavy, and the cold was biting. He needed sound, he needed movement. He turned on the radio, but all he got was static, loud and grating. He started running back and forth, jumping slightly, trying to stir the air. He heard the doors open upstairs. Not the sound of an alarm, but the sound of heavy wooden doors being pushed inward, one after another, echoing through the empty halls. Whatever had been waiting for him to break Rule 14 was now moving down from the third floor. He looked around wildly. He saw Rule 21. The final alarm is silence. The static on the radio suddenly cut out. Complete silence returned, heavy and absolute. The temperature dropped instantly. Drew felt like he had been dropped into a pool of ice water. He knew the final alarm had sounded. He scrambled under the reception desk, looking for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. He huddled in the dark space beneath the counter, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the last rule on the paper, the one that must have been a last resort. Rule 22. If the silence comes, the last defense is stillness. Do not move, do not breathe loudly, do not make yourself visible above the desk line. Drew froze. He held his breath until his lungs burned. He could hear it, now a wet, dragging sound coming down the stairs, slow and steady, mixing with a low, wet sucking noise. The smell of burnt iron returned, so strong it tasted metallic on his tongue. The dragging stopped right in front of the reception desk. Drew could see the floorboards just inches from his face. A shadow fell over the desk, tall and impossibly thin, blocking the flickering emergency light. He could hear a sound like someone slowly chewing wet cotton right above his head. Then, a single elongated finger, black and slick with moisture, tapped lightly on the polished brass plaque. Tap. The finger moved away. The shadow did not. Drew kept his eyes fixed on the floorboards, obeying Rule 22 perfectly. He didn't move. He didn't even dare to blink. The chewing sound continued above him, occasionally mixed with a low, wet whisper that seemed to be testing the syllables of his name. D. R. E. The sound slowly faded, moving toward the basement door. Drew heard the scraping sound of metal against metal, and then the heavy steel door slammed shut. The temperature slowly climbed back to normal. The lobby lights came back on, shining steadily. When he finally crawled out, he saw the yellowed paper lying on the desk. He picked it up. He saw that Rule 22 had a fresh, thick, red circle drawn around it. Beneath the rule, scratched into the paper like someone used a fingernail, was one new word: next. He didn't check the basement door. He didn't check the third floor. He just sat at the desk until the sun came up, hugging the paper to his chest. When the day guard arrived, Drew handed in his keys and quit the job without saying a single word about the night. Drew never took another night shift again, but he kept the paper. He reads the rules every night before bed, especially the one at the very bottom, because he knows whatever was in that building knows his name now. He knows it only used the rules to hunt him, and the final new word was not a warning. It was a promise. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more terrifying tales from the deep end of the night. He bought the house cheap because of the water damage, but the real rot was hidden behind a sealed wall, and whatever was scratching inside wanted out. Welcome back to the Black Hour Stories. Moving into a fixer-upper is an American dream, but sometimes you find things the previous owners never wanted anyone to see. This is the story of a man who found a secret room sealed behind solid stone, and the noise that proved he hadn't just bought a house, he had bought a cage. The old Victorian house had been empty for 3 years. It was cheap because of the needed repairs, which suited Mark just fine. He planned to renovate slowly, room by room. The first room he tackled was the pantry off the kitchen. It was small, dusty, and always smelled faintly of old vinegar and wood rot. He was pulling down the old shelves when he noticed a strange section of the wall near the floor. It was in the back corner. The plaster there was much thicker, and the air around that spot felt noticeably cooler than the rest of the room, even with the windows open. When he put his hand on the spot, it felt like cold stone beneath the surface, not the standard wood lath and plaster of the rest of the wall. Mark grabbed a small hammer and tapped it. Every part of the wall sounded hollow, like a drum, but this section gave off a flat, dull, dense thunk. It sounded solid, almost like concrete or a block of stone. The section was about 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. He got a chisel and carefully picked away the top layer of plaster. Sure enough, underneath was a rough, gray-black stone wall, expertly fitted together without mortar showing. It had been plastered over and painted repeatedly for possibly 100 years. Mark was excited. This was a secret closet, maybe a safe, or even a hidden compartment. It added value, he thought. He went to bed that night, leaving the exposed stone wall ready for inspection the next day. The house was dead quiet. Sometime after 2 a.m., Mark woke up sharply. He didn't know why he woke up at first. Then he heard it, a very faint, dry scratching sound coming from downstairs. It was rhythmic and quick, like a small, desperate animal trapped behind the woodwork. He assumed it was mice. The house was old. Of course, there were mice. He rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. But the sound didn't stop. It was too regular, too focused on one spot. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, scratch. It wasn't moving side to side like a rodent would. It stayed fixed on the spot where he had uncovered the stone wall in the pantry. Mark sat up in bed. He told himself it was just the plaster settling around the newly exposed wall, or maybe a massive rat. But the sound was growing heavier. It was starting to sound less like claws on wood and more like something bony and dry trying to dig its way through dense material. It sounded like fingernails scraping on stone. He got up, grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, and went downstairs. The scratching was much louder now. It was definitely coming from the pantry wall. He stood in the cold pantry and pointed the beam at the stone. The scratching was frantic and violent, focused low, near the floor. It was so loud he could feel a light vibration through his boots on the tile floor. Mark stepped back quickly. This was no rat. The sound was too heavy. A normal animal would have panicked and run. This was dedicated. It was an action with a goal, like someone working a tiny hammer and chisel from the inside of the wall. He left the pantry door open and went into the kitchen. He could still hear the furious scraping. He stood there, holding the flashlight. The noise stopped suddenly, as if the thing inside knew he was standing there, listening. The resulting silence felt like a heavy blanket had been thrown over the house. The next morning, the wall was silent. Mark went into the pantry. He looked at the base of the stone wall where the scratching had been centered. There was a small pile of debris on the floor. It wasn't wood dust, and it wasn't mouse droppings. It was a fine, gray, oily dust mixed with tiny, hard, grayish-white fragments that looked like dried mortar or maybe bone chips. The dust had a terrible odor, faint but noticeable, like old, dried meat or stagnant water. Mark swept it up and threw it away. He decided to hire a professional mason to chip away the rest of the plaster and see what was behind the stone. He didn't want to break through it himself anymore. He spent the whole day working in other rooms, but by late afternoon, the scratching had started again. This time, it was louder, almost rhythmic, like a desperate drum beat. Thick scratching. He tried turning on the radio, blasting music, but the scratching simply increased its volume to match the music, a low, constant counterpoint. He had to get closer. He walked back to the pantry. He saw a few more piles of the gray dust and bone chips on the floor, larger than the morning's pile. The thing was working quickly. He shone the flashlight over the stone wall. Near the bottom, where the scratching was happening, he noticed a tiny hairline crack about 6 inches long. The repeated clawing had started to open the seal. He moved the beam to the crack and lowered his head. As he did, the scratching stopped instantly. Total silence. He pressed his ear close to the cold stone wall, trying to hear breathing or movement. Nothing. It was waiting for him. He reached up and gently placed his fingers on the crack. The air that came out was intensely cold, colder than the surrounding stone, and carried that terrible, bitter smell. He felt a light, almost imperceptible suction, like the air inside was trying to pull the outside air in. Then, from the darkness of the crack, something tiny, pointed, and very hard jabbed out and grazed his fingertip. Mark yelled and pulled his hand back, stumbling away from the wall. The sound of the frantic scratching immediately returned, 3 times as loud as before, but now there was a sound of low, wet snuffling mixed in with the noise. He looked at his finger. There was no blood, but a small, neat puncture mark just under the nail. He realized whatever had come out of the wall had been a sharp, thin claw, too small to be a raccoon, too sharp to be a typical rodent. He knew he couldn't leave the wall like that. He ran back to the garage, grabbed a can of industrial-strength foam sealant, and ran back to the pantry. He jammed the narrow tube into the small, growing crack. The instant the sealant started expanding into the wall, the thing behind the stone screamed. It was a high, thin, scraping noise, like a metal file hitting glass. The clawing became maniacal, attacking the wall in multiple places at once. He could hear small bits of mortar and stone popping out, hitting the floor behind him. Mark backed away, running the length of the sealant tube into the crack until the can was empty. He watched the white foam expand. He backed out of the pantry, shutting the door. The loud, terrified, furious scratching continued from behind the stone. He could hear the thing slamming itself against the solid rock, now trapped again by the expanding foam. He leaned against the kitchen wall, gasping. He was shaking from the noise and the smell. He knew he had to get out of the house, but he stopped when he heard a new sound coming from the pantry. The scratching had stopped. The foam must have set. But now, a new sound came from the silence. It was a sound of wet, deep breathing, slow and heavy, coming from directly behind the pantry door. It wasn't struggling anymore. The thing was quiet. It was free, and it was waiting on the other side of the door. Mark sold the house a week later. He told the new buyers the hidden room was part of the original structure and needed specialized restoration. He never told them about the constant smell of dried meat or the breathing he heard coming from behind the sealed pantry door. He drives past the old place sometimes, but he notices one thing. The new owners always keep the pantry light on 24 hours a day. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more terrifying tales from the deep end of the night. He had worked in the morgue for 10 years and knew death was quiet and still. But the new arrival in the refrigerator unit was starting to move and learning how to speak. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. When you deal with the dead, you learn that silence is the biggest rule. Everything is cold, everything is routine, and everything is still. This is the story of a morgue attendant who learned that sometimes silence isn't rest, it's just a pause, and the things that break the rules of life can also break the rules of death. The attendant, whose name was David, had worked the late shift at the county morgue for a decade. He was used to the chemical smell of the place, the constant high hum of the ventilation, and the metallic chill that settled deep into the bones. He wasn't scared of the dead. They were just heavy meat, silent and harmless. He had only one intake that night. The body was a man in his late 50s, marked as a sudden cardiac event. The man was placed on the stainless steel autopsy table. David followed the procedure, checked the paperwork, took photos, and attached the identification tag securely to the man's toe. The tag was thick paper on a string, stamped clearly with the word deceased. David wheeled the body tray into the main cold storage room. The room was a wall of heavy metal doors looking like oversized file cabinets. He opened Unit C4, slid the tray in, and locked the door shut. The process was done. Now he just had to sit in his office, fill out charts, and wait for the sun to come up. A little after 1 a.m., the quiet started to feel wrong. The high hum of the ventilation seemed to be cycling strangely, dipping down into a deep groan every few minutes, then roaring back up. The air was colder than usual, even for the morgue. David rubbed his hands together and stared at the clock. Then he heard something from the cold storage room. It was faint, muffled by the heavy steel doors, but undeniably there. It sounded like a wet cough, followed by a light scraping sound. David told himself it was the refrigerator unit settling, or maybe ice breaking off the cooling coils. But the sound was repeated, clearer this time, a distinct wet catch of breath. He knew where the body was, C4. He put down his pen, grabbed a clipboard, and walked over to the refrigeration wall. He listened at C4. Nothing. Just the mechanical hum. He told himself he was tired. He was about to turn away when he noticed the toe tag. The string was visible through the thin crack where the door met the frame. The tag was flapping, tapping lightly against the metal door, back and forth. But there was no airflow in the room, certainly not enough to make a small paper tag swing. David pressed his ear against the heavy steel door again. He heard a very faint, dry sound, like fingernails scratching the inside of the metal tray. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something inside C4 was moving. He had two choices: walk away and pretend he hadn't heard anything, or check the body. His training forced his hand. If a refrigeration unit failed, he had to report it. He reached for the handle. He pulled open the heavy steel door. The body tray slid out with a low, grating sound. The body was still lying there, covered by the sheet. The smell of cold, sterile chemicals intensified. David quickly looked for the toe tag. It wasn't on the man's toe. He saw the string, loose and empty, hanging off the sheet. He pulled the sheet down slightly to look at the man's feet. The toe tag was gone. He ran his flashlight beam quickly over the man's chest. Everything looked normal, gray, still, dead. He slid the sheet back up, thinking the tag must have fallen onto the floor. But as he looked, he saw something unnatural. The man's mouth was not shut tightly as David had left it. The lips were slightly parted, and the skin around the mouth looked unnaturally damp. And then he saw it, a small dark stain on the white sheet right over the man's sternum. It looked like a drop of water, maybe drool, but it hadn't been there before. He shone the light back into the cold unit. There, crumpled into a tight ball in the corner of the tray space, was the toe tag. The string was ripped off. The body had somehow removed its own tag and dropped it inside the unit. David felt the panic rising up his throat, but he kept his voice steady. "Unit C4, he muttered into his recorder, trying to sound routine. Toe tag detached, possible ... double quotes. He didn't finish the sentence. The body on the tray moved. Not a twitch or a spasm. It was a slow, deliberate movement. The man's right arm rose an inch off the sheet, the fingers curling slightly. Then the arm dropped back down, heavy and wet-sounding. David backed up 2 steps. His body screamed at him to run, but his mind was frozen by the impossible reality of what he had just seen. The body sat up. It was not a quick, frightened movement. It was slow and mechanical, like an old machine starting up. The dead man sat upright on the tray, the sheet falling to his waist. His skin was the color of old marble, and his eyes were open, wide and glossy gray. They stared past David at the wall behind him. Then the head swiveled slowly. It turned to face David. The movement was unnatural, too slow and too rigid, like the neck was broken. A sound came from the man's throat. It was a guttural, thick rattle, like rocks grinding together, not a voice at all. C4... The voice was deep and scraping, impossibly heavy. It was not the voice of the dead man. It was something using the dead man's throat like an instrument. David dropped his clipboard. He turned and ran toward the door of the morgue office, slamming the metal door shut behind him. He fumbled with the key, locking it from the inside, his hands shaking violently. As soon as the lock clicked, the steel-cold unit door in the hall was slammed shut with a terrible crash. David stood there, terrified, waiting for the sound of the refrigeration unit to slide back in. But he heard the sound of wheels on linoleum. The heavy metal tray was rolling down the hallway, coming toward his office door. Then the scraping voice spoke again, much closer now, right outside the door. The sound resonating through the heavy steel. The tag ... says ... deceased ... The entity knew what the tag said. It knew the rules of the living and the dead. And it was reminding David that it had already broken those rules. David stood there, alone in the small office, listening to the heavy metal wheels stop right outside the door, and the sound of something cold and wet pressing against the steel. The police found David the next morning, huddled in the corner of the locked office. The door to C4 was open, and the tray was gone. There was no sign of the body or the tray itself. The only thing left in the hallway was a small crumpled piece of paper, thick and wet, stuck to the floor. It was the toe tag. The word deceased was still clearly visible. But when the coroner looked closely, he saw that the letters were wet and smeared, as if someone had licked them clean. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more terrifying tales from the deep end of the night.